Good afternoon. I see there, by the way, many friends of mine in the audience, and I'm delighted to see all the rest of you here. I'm Tweed Roosevelt, and I'm a university professor at Long Island University. I'm also chairman of the Theodore Roosevelt Institute and president emeritus of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. And by the way, I'm a great grandson of TR. So this is going to be the first in a series of sessions, probably have about a dozen of them. This one's called Tales of TR, and it's brought to you by the Theodore Roosevelt Institute at Long Island University. Their webpage is roosevelt.liu.edu, and you should go at some point and look there. There's lots of stuff there. So as I say, this is Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands. Now, this was a very formative period of TR's life. It had a huge effect upon him. He, in fact, later on said, "The romance of my life began in North Dakota." And I think it really is true. Now, the problem I'm facing today is there's just so much material. There have been at least a dozen books on this. And so I'm going to try to sort of skim through things. It's not going to be just about TR, but about the West at the time, and I hope you'll find it interesting. It'll all be done with slides, and maybe I'll never appear there in person, but that's okay. And so we'll go through slides. At the end, we'll have a Q&A, a question and answer. And if you look at the place where the toolbar is on your screen, you'll see a Q&A little place there. If you tap on that and type in your questions, they'll be given to me later. So that should be fine. And one of the purposes of this, I think, is to convince you to go to North Dakota, particularly to the Badlands where TR was raised. It's a wonderful place and a wonderful experience. All right, let's get started here. Let's set the stage. Let me see if everything works. And so here we go. Let's start at the beginning. This is where TR was born in New York City. He was born at home, as people were then. He was part of a Roosevelt family. He was an 8th generation. It's a Dutch family. And in fact, in the family, they only married Dutch, who were very insular. They, in fact, spoke Dutch. Even TR knew a little, but all the generations before spoke Dutch at home. It was a very much settled society like that. In fact, TR's dad was the first person in our family line to marry outside of Dutch. It was a wealthy family, mostly business, and down through the generation, it started with farmers, then property, then import, export, and eventually the financial business. TR, when he was young, was a very sickly boy. He had asthma, which in those days was a killer, and he was lucky to survive. It was a terribly scary experience for him and his family because when the shortness of breath that came kind of looked like it might kill him at any moment. And what a lot of people forget too is it's also very scary to his doctors. But in any case, his parents worked hard at it. His father once told him that he had a weak body and he had to build up his body. And so he began an exercise program and slowly started to build himself up. And that may or may not have helped with the asthma, but by the time he was a teenager, it was mostly relapses, but he still did it. But it developed in him this urge for a strenuous life, as he called it, and for exercise and the outdoors and all sorts of related things, which affected his life in many ways. Here he is at Harvard. He went to Harvard. He'd been homeschooled and only been in a school for maybe half a year. The whole time he was homeschooled by tutors and his parents. He went to Harvard, which was very unusual for a New York kid. The schools in those days were quite parochial, and most people in New York went to King's or Columbia College. But he went to Harvard. He did very well there. He was an athlete, as you can see. He's looking pretty good here. And he studied very well. He finished pretty well in his class. He only had 2 girlfriends in his life. His first girlfriend, before he went to college, was a girl named Edith, and something happened, and by the time he went to college, they had broken up. And when in college, he met Alice Lee. And here's a photograph taken at the time. This, of course, is TR. You look at his mutton chops, which I think are really cool. And this is Alice Lee being sort of divided from him by the chaperone, if you will, a very good friend of Alice's. And TR engineered the picture. So the next one happens, and you see now here he is much closer to his beloved. And there was a 2-year courtship. Alice was not at all attracted to him to begin with. And she made comments like one time to TR, or Teddy, or Ted. She called him Teddy, the only person who really ever did. Teddy, he didn't dance, he hopped. And he was a kind of an odd kid and interested in animals and taxidermy and all sorts of things that were not immediately attractive to a Boston socialite from the Boston family. In any case, he eventually, at senior year, won her over, and she agreed to marry him. They then moved to New York, where, that's a little early, I guess, where he first went to law school at Columbia, and then decided that he wanted to get involved in politics. Now, in those days, people from his background, the upper classes in New York, did not get involved in politics. Politics was the realm of the immigrant, particularly the Irish and Germans, Tammany Hall, all that. But he announced, he said, I want to be part of the ruling class. And so he started right at the bottom in local politics. And but Rose got elected to the legislature, and was kind of established in the legislature. At first, he was considered a person of some humor, but eventually he began to show his grit, and people began to take to him. And he was very much a reformer at the time. This is the first cartoon ever done of him, and it shows him, he's in the legislature, it shows him here in a police outfit. Little did they know eventually he'd become police commissioner, but not yet, chasing out the Tammany Hall types. Well, there he is, rather handsome young guy at this age. And one day at a dinner at a place called Clark's Restaurant, it was dinner, it was a sort of a fundraiser, if you will, a free trade dinner that people talked about free trade. He met this guy, Geringe. And Geringe was a very interesting character. He'd been a naval officer. He became famous for bringing Cleopatra's Needle, an Egyptian obelisk, to New York, where it now resides behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which, by the way, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History were both founded by TR's father. In any case, it's the twin of the one in London, the Cleopatra's Needle that you know in London. But that perhaps originally attracted TR to him because he was a naval officer and TR was very interested in the Navy. But what they got talking about was the West, particularly Dakota Territory, particularly the Badlands, where Geringe had an operation, sort of a hunter's camp. And he tried to talk, he wanted to talk TR in going with him to hunt buffalo. And TR was delighted with the idea. He had been a hunter all his life, and he was very interested in hunting buffalo. So he agreed to go, and he agreed. But at the last minute, Geringe couldn't go. So TR got on a train to go out there, leaving his wife, of course, in New York. And a 4-day trip it took. And at 2:30 in the morning, he arrived in North Dakota at Little Missouri, as it was called then, the town that's now Medora. And here's the train station that you can see. And there was one building there. There were a couple of others elsewhere, but this building was the hotel. It was called the Pyramid Park Hotel. Well, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. He had to stumble around. There's no lights there. He finally found the hotel, pounded on the door, awoke the very grumpy and not at all sober landlord who came down yelling at him, let him in, put him up into the top here. You can just see there was a huge bunk room with something like 15 beds. one of which was left, and he climbed into that. The next morning, he came down, and it was his first introduction to Western life. All these cowboys up there racing down when the gong was banged or the cymbals were banged for breakfast. He rushed down. There was one bowl of greasy, dark water with a very greasy towel to wipe your hands on, and then you ate as quickly as you can at breakfast. He was looking for a guide, so he asked the landlord, is there anybody around here? And the landlord recommended him to go over to a store, a local store, and there's an image of it in which it was called Joe Ferris's store, and Joe Ferris was the man that ran it, and he could sometimes be convinced to do to guide people. So there he is, period picture. We'll have lots of these as we go along. And so TR tried to engage Ferris. Ferris was very suspicious of TR at the time, as everyone else was there, because TR looked like a dude. He wasn't dressed properly. He was kind of a nervous sort that jammed around. He was an odd character, and they kind of looked askance at him. But the thing that bothered them most about him was TR had these big, round, thick glasses. And out there in the West at the time, glasses were considered a sign of moral weakness. So, but he waved around some money, and Willis was willing to take on the job. So they collected all their stuff. It took them all day. They got a wagon. They loaded it up, and they started going north, upriver of the Little Missouri. This is the Little Missouri River here. And first person they ran across was this guy, Elbridge Paddock. He was kind of the grand old man of the area, a man of a very checkered past. He was a tough guy, convicted of murder, or not convicted, but people knew that he did murders. He was tried, never convicted, and a ruffian. And this kind of began an uneasy relationship. He viewed himself as kind of the big guy there. TR had broken one of the triggers of one of the parts of one of his guns and asked to borrow one from Paddock. Surprisingly, he gave him one, and they parted as, at least acquaintances. Over the years, next few years, they had a off again, on again relationship, but he was always a bit of a character. Well, onto the horses they go, and they start going north. The first ranch, which was, a couple of miles, maybe 3 miles upstream, was the Eaton Custer Ranch. It was where Custer went through on the way to the Little Bighorn. And the Eaton Ranch eventually became the famous Eaton Ranches. I think they're in Wyoming now, dude ranches, but this is where they had their start. And then from there, he went on to this little ranch. This is the Maltese Cross Ranch. There's the ranch building. This picture was taken at about that time. And you can see the outbuilding in the ranch house. And in the ranch, there was being run by two people, one of whom was Joe Ferris's brother, and then another fellow named Merrifield. This fellow we'll come to later. It's there he is. That's a guy named Lincoln Gregor Lang, and we'll come to him later. So this is where they were going to spend the first night. And in the cabin, the picture obviously wasn't taken in the cabin, it's in front of a set, but it was a very primitive cabin. These two ranchers who were ranching about, 300, maybe 150 cattle on something called shares, which was the very sort of typical way there. A rancher would have his ranch house, and then somebody with money would buy cows, and they would share the profits from them on whatever the contract was. So they had a relationship with somebody back east who's a little sketchy person, but anyway, that was their relationship. And TR came in with Joe Ferris, and they looked at him askance, as they say. And they started playing cards, and it was a pretty strange situation. And all of a sudden, they had a hen house out back, and the hens were attacked by a raccoon or some bobcat, and they all raced out to deal with the bobcat, and there's a lot of yelling and shrieking and jumping up and down and everything. And when they came back, the ice had been broken. So the evening went on, TR asking, as he always did, endless questions. And it came time to go to bed. There were there were 3 bunks, I guess, in the cabin. TR refused to take a bunk. He rolled up in his blanket on the floor and slept on the floor. This went over very well with these folks. And they were now much more sort of willing to look at him with less suspicion. Well, the next morning, TR had been tired of riding in the buckboard and wanted a horse. And he asked these 2 if they'd lend him a horse, and they were still a little suspicious of him. So they said no, but they relented when he offered to buy the horse. And so he did, and off they went to their next destination. This is give you an idea of what the land looks like. It's beautiful country. It's not always green, but this is pretty green. And this was the kind of land he was driving for. You can just see here the Little Missouri, which flows north here, and they were riding south up the Little Missouri. And they were going to the Lang's ranch house. They took them all day. It was about 25, 30 miles. They had to cross the river some 23 times to get to the ranch. They arrived at sunset and went inside, and they were greeted by Gregor Lang and his son Lincoln, who was a young teenager at the time. Gregor Lang was a Scotsman who was also there on shares, an interesting guy. And TR and Lang took up together right away. And so Joe, who was tired, was asleep. There you see Lincoln in the background and TR and Gregor talking at the table. They talked until 2 or 3 o'clock at night. TR was always full of questions and asked him everything he could think of about everything. And this was where they were going to use as kind of their headquarters for searching for the buffalo. So and they were going to start off the next morning. When they got up in the morning, remember, TR's pretty tired. He'd been riding hard for 2 days, working really hard, been on a train for 4 days, and probably hadn't had much sleep, certainly not at the Pyramid Park Hotel. But in any case, he was raring to go. Well, it was pouring rain, and you haven't seen anything until you've been in the Badlands and been in the pouring rain, because there's a very clay-like mud called gumbo. And whenever you go out, it sticks to you and it'll cling onto your boots, adding pounds and pounds and get all over it. It's pretty miserable. Joe Ferris was looking forward to TR, saying, well, let's wait a day. We won't go out today, but not TR. So off they go in the rain. And they're gone all day, and the Langs are waiting for them to come back, expecting them at any time, but they don't get back until late in the evening, or at least after dark. And it's still raining. So another night happens. Willis falls asleep almost immediately. TR and Gregor talk until 1 or 2 o'clock. They get up the next morning, and it starts all over again. Still pouring, and off they go. Rough country, don't see anything, don't see any game. They're out all day. This goes on for 4 days. And I'm not going to tell the whole story of this hunt. They're all sort of similar, but I'll give you enough so you get some idea. Well, on the 5th day, it's cleared up. And so Lang and Roosevelt are going out now for the 5th time, and they spend all the day searching for buffalo. All kinds of events during the day, all kinds of excitement happen. Horses step into gopher holes and take somersaults. Clay buttes give away from underneath of them. The horses wander into quicksand and have to be hauled out. When they're stalking, you crawl around and put your hands in cactuses. There were just lots of adventures. If you're interested in this sort of thing, read TR's book. For the next 2 or 3 days, 3 days, I guess, they're out there looking for buffalo. They spot a buffalo. The buffalo is shot, but only wounded. They follow it. It gets dark. They set up camp. They have the horses with them. It pours all night. In the middle of the night, something comes, probably wolves, spooks the horses. They run off into the night in the rain. TR and Joe have to find the horses, bring them back, tie them to their saddles. There's nothing to tie anything to there. Tie them to the saddles and spend the rest of the night. When the morning comes, it turns out they were in kind of a little rivulet. And Joe is astonished to hear TR mutter as he wakes up, thinking he's going to be swearing or something. Mutter say, "Bully, bully, boy, isn't this fun?" He had a lot of energy. Anyway, this goes on another day or two. Eventually, TR shoots a buffalo, and eventually they go back to this cabin. Now, TR had been talking to Gregor about ranching and the whole thing, about the interest in it and whether he should get involved in it. And then he asked Gregor, actually the night before, he says, "Would you come work for me?" Gregor says, "No, I can't, I'm under contract, but how about those people from the Maltese Cross?" So TR says, "Bring them up." So they come up on the night after the hunt is over, and they sit around and talk for several hours. And TR is talking to these two guys from the Maltese Cross and asking them eventually, he's willing to go into business. Would they work for him? And they said, yeah, they probably can. They'd have to go east and get out of their contract, but they think they can do that. They could work for him. And TR said, all right, what do you need for money? And they said, well, to start, we'll need $14,000. Well, I'm going to convert all the money we talk about as we go on. $14,000 was $350,000. He said, all right. He wrote a check, gave it to them. They said, well, don't you want a contract or something? He said, nope, handshake will do it. He gave him basically $350,000 on a handshake. And that was the beginning of the ranching experience. Well, I won't go into as much detail in later stories, but at this point, he returns back to New York. I should have shown you that was a map of where he went. So he goes back, and there's Alice. He meets, of course, Alice again, and she's pregnant now. He's in the legislature. He's driving, going up to Albany, where he's in the legislature, and she's getting pretty close to time to give birth. He's up at the legislature. She's her time is coming. She's well, TR's mother, Mitty, comes and stays with her to help her at the birth, and they're together. And TR's up in Albany when word comes by telegram that the baby has been born. It's a little girl, and he's delighted, and his fellow legislators are delighted, and slapping hands. Well, a little later that day, he gets a cable from his brother, who's there also. Says, you better come home. Things don't look so good. So he gets on a train to go back to New York, and it takes forever. It's bad weather. He gets to their house at about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and he's met on the stairs, on the stoop going into the house by his brother, who says to him, there's a curse on this house, and your mother, our mother and your wife are dying. He goes into the house. It's Valentine's Day, actually. And he's with his wife, and his brother comes and says, you better speak to our mother. She's not going to last long. She's dying of disease. He goes, she dies. Then he goes back to his wife, who has something called Bright's disease, which is sort of exasperated by the birth, and she dies later that day. They both die on the same day in the same house. Devastating, devastating. TR, needless to say, is in shock. Here's the baby girl. So he's a father of a motherless child. He writes this in his diary. The light of my life, the light has gone out of my life. You can see there, it's the 14th with a cross. A couple of days later, at the Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue, there is a funeral, and here's the interior of the funeral. You can imagine he was completely, or maybe you can't imagine, he was completely in shock. I can't imagine. I lost my wife and my mother in the same year, and that was bad enough. I don't can't imagine how he could go through both of them on the same day. Anyway, he went back to the legislature briefly and then returned to the West. And he was a broken man. The West was beautiful as ever, but he saw it differently then, I think. He saw it as dark, dismal place, as one can easily understand. This area was called by some hell with the fire out. And TR once commented, he said, the Badlands, it looks the way Poe sounds, which I think is an interesting way of putting it. But he plunged into frenetic effort. So for several weeks, he just rode and shot and kept moving all the time. Once he was 72 miles in one day. Sometimes he'd ride all night. He commented once, he said, black care rarely rides behind a horseman whose pace is fast enough. And that's how he did it for a while. And slowly things got a little better. One of the things he really wanted out there was a buckskin fringed outfit. And he heard that there was a lady named Maddox, old widow Maddox. She was an older lady, a rather extraordinary lady, one of the several most amazing women who were out there. She was a widow, had a ranch, which she ran herself, a sort of a minimal thing. And so what he wanted to do is ride out there, shoot an antelope, and have her make an outfit. But he didn't shoot an antelope, so he went there and commissioned her to do it. This is the outfit, and you can see a couple of things here. This is done in front of a set later on in New York. It's a fringed outfit. It's really quite something. And there he is with his rifle, a finger on the trigger, and this extraordinary Tiffany-made knife he had, which you can't really see the handle, but it's a silver handle. It's really spectacular. And this is what he wore. You can imagine what the Westerners thought of him, that they did not wear fringed suits. So this is a Davy Crockett kind of outfit. But in any case, he got it. He shot his antelope on the way back, but then it was kind of a little too late. So here's the town of Medora. It started out as the Little Missouri, and for reasons I'll explain in a little while, name was changed to Medora and was moved across the river. So that's really what it looked like. A very interesting place at the time. And I want to tell you a little about how it was there and who was there. I think this will surprise you. Here is the plot, which was made, and those are the lots that were sold or attempted to be sold. So it was the usual real estate developer's idea of what to do there. And you can see the river and the railroad. That's where the town is today. Well, that year in 1840, census was done of Billings County. So these are all the people in the county. The county was a little different than it is today. Today, the county is the size of Rhode Island, and it was probably larger then. So this is very interesting when you look at this, and entirely different than I thought. My friend Doug Ellison, who has a bookstore in Medora now, dug this up and gave it to me. He's a sort of a local historian, a great guy. In any case, there were 737 people there. And it's not surprising when you average the ages of everybody, it was young. So that's what you would think. Average age was 24. What is surprising is that there were so many children there. Of the 737 children under 16, there were 221 children. And you think of it as if it was all just young cowboys there. There were 89 families, and 3/4 of them with children, roughly 3.5 kids per family. And remember, these are young families. They were going to grow up and have more families. There were also older people there. 29 of the inhabitants were over 50. And again, not really what you would think. The one of the things this census does is tells you where these people were born. And that's very interesting too. Fully a third of them were foreign born. Roughly a third of them were foreign born. And they came from everywhere, Russia and as far away as Jamaica, of all places. Canada was the most common with 64, followed by Ireland. 52 people were born in Ireland. And then Sweden, 28, Norway, 27, and the rest were spattering all over the place. Now, the US born people were interesting too. Of course, he was born at this time in North Dakota. The US born, well, you'd expect the biggest number, which was from Minnesota, the next door state. But the other two were a little more interesting. The first of all was 56 of them were born in New York, and 40 were born in Pennsylvania. That surprised me anyway. I think New York maybe, because you got to keep in mind that some of the people coming out here didn't want to know where people came from. Wives or debt or the law or whatever. It's very common. So maybe they just chose New York because it was sufficiently anonymous that nobody could track them back. So here's to give you an idea of one of the family members. These are the Roberts. Margaret, they're an extraordinary woman. It's interesting what happened about the time that TR came. Her husband, who was a very respectable guy, had some money that he was going off to try to buy cows, and he never came back. It's thought that he was murdered for his money. So she was left alone with 5 little baby girls, which she raised herself on the farm, on the ranch, with no money. And she was another extraordinary woman that lived out there. There were a number like that. Another surprise was that there were 9 blacks. And here's one of them. This is John Tyler. Don't know all that much about him. He was a cowboy. Many of the cowboys were black, either ex-slaves or children of slaves, came west to make it. He was well respected, stayed there all his life, became a rancher, owned cattle, did very well. The other blacks, I don't know much about, except one woman who was probably, I suppose, she was the person that was born in Jamaica. And imagine coming all the way from Jamaica to North Dakota. There were 2 Chinese, believe it or not, and I won't surprise you that they ran the local laundry. And they weren't mentioned interestingly enough, in the census, and neither was the one other person, an Indian. And not all the women were, as they called them then, honest. Here's the local bar, and there were the women in the oldest profession there. My guess is there were maybe 4 or 5. The bar, of course, was the center of town, and great hijinks. All sorts of things happened. One of the things they used to do is the train came through, they would stage gunfights in the street for the passengers from New York on the way to wherever they were going. And this would be reported in the New York papers that there was yet another gunfight. Well, they were all staged. Now I want to introduce you to another extraordinary character there. This is the Marquis de Mores, and he arrived to great fanfare out there. He's a very romantic background. His father was a French duke, distantly related to the throne. He was a Catholic, Orleanist, went to the French military academy, St. Prior. He was a duelist, many duels. He killed some people, cavalry officer, but not a lot of money. So he was looking for a rich wife in France, and he really lucked out. That's him. Oh, that's him. Went over that quickly. That's just him in his Western garb. He lucked out. He found Medora. Medora von Hoffmann was the daughter of a minor German nobility, but her father moved to New York and became a businessman, extremely successful Wall Street, second most successful house on Wall Street. And she was raised in a very luxurious style. And their match was a real love match as well. So she not only provided the money, but they were a terrific couple. Her parents were so wealthy that her spending account each year given to her by her father in today's dollars was $2 million. And when de Mores married her, her father settled on him $13 million as a dowry. And when she came out west, she came with 20 servants and a piano and all kinds of furniture and all kinds of other stuff was shipped in. So she was quite different than everybody else there. There she is, but she took to the life. There she is in Western garb. Her husband was an excellent shot, but he always said that she was a better shot than he, and she really took into it. She was an artist too, and that's the house they built. I've forgotten how many rooms it has, but they called it a chateau, and it's 2 stories. It's quite a place. And that's where they lived. Well, they made a huge splash. Her family came from this kind of place. There's the family all together. There's de Mores. There she is. That's her father. So what was de Mores doing out there? There was something called the beef bonanza. This was a whole thought that you could make millions if you took southern beef cattle from Texas and so on and took them to the northern plains. The buffaloes were gone. There were huge places to graze them. It was thought it could be wonderfully successful. So he arrived out there, but he wasn't satisfied with just being a rancher. He wanted to become the middleman for the beef processing operation. At that time, pretty much all was processed in places like Chicago, mostly. The Swift Company and Armour and ones you've heard of all started then, very rich and powerful slaughterhouses, and in Kansas City. And he thought that if he could build a beef slaughterhouse in Medora, he could get the cows without having to ship them all the way east, and then he could process the beef, send it both to New York and to the West Coast, cut out the middlemen, and would become fabulously wealthy, because his aim was to get wealthy and eventually bring the royalty back to France, and if he was lucky, since he was in line for the throne, maybe even become king. So this was a wonderful thing. They sunk all kinds of money into it. He got his father-in-law to produce it. The first thing he did was build a beef processing plant. $20 million they spent. Well, the whole thing looked pretty good, except there were some fundamental problems in sort of the strategic plan. One problem was the beef there, you couldn't fatten it. And they didn't have the kind of feedlots that you had in Chicago. So what they did was used local products, and the beef was lean and even yellow, and people wouldn't buy it. So he started all kinds of other, they all failed. And eventually, like everybody out there, failed. Well, let me go here. There was a guy sort of interesting. This guy's name, Stuart Grenville. Out there, there was no law to speak of. Here. There was no law to speak of, and the cattle rangers. And so they thought they'd have a private sort of vigilante group called the Stranglers. And de Mores went out there. But it's sort of typical of tall tales at the time. This was totally untrue, never happened, and a good thing too. I don't know how TR's life would have been different if he'd been a vigilante. They took TR decided to go to the Bighorn Mountains, and so off they went in this kind of carriage. It was a long trip, 7 weeks. They only spent about 15 days out there. It took them 7 weeks to get there and get back. Uh, they, you can see how far it is, all the way from here down to here. The hunting stories was similar to all the others. Again, if you're interested, read his books. He shot elk and grizzly, and got back to, followed within that little wagon there. Finally got tired of it, and as they were getting close, he rode all night for 9 hours after all day to get back. Let's see. Let's talk a little about his ranch. Here it is. He had 2 ranches, the Maltese Cross, and then north of Medora, about 20, 30 miles, he built the Elkhorn Ranch. And this is a plan of it. This was all done. He had 2 helpers that he brought from the east with him, and they built this cabin. This is interesting because this photograph was taken by TR, and TR was an avid photographer. He developed all his films in the basement, and all through it, you see many of them have been lost. I'd love to find them, but there are lots of photographs that he took. The weather could be terrible. It was hot, it was cold, it'd get 50 below, dry heat, the whole Western experience. But there's his camera, by the way, old brownie box. I remember those, maybe some of you do. Any case, the 2 guys he brought with him had wives, and they brought their wives. One of them had a child. Within a year, both wives produced, this one the second child, this one her first, within a week of each other. These are some visiting people. So it was, again, somewhat different than you might have thought. Roundups were the big time there. This was open range cattle raising. So in other words, you just let your cows go to wherever they wanted. And once a year, sometimes twice, you'd round them up, brand the calves, do what you needed to do. And this would take several weeks and cover thousands of miles. And it was here that TR made his mark. At first, the other cowboys and ranchers were suspicious of him with his glasses and fringe jacket and all that. But he was willing to work harder and longer than anyone else. He showed his grit pretty quickly. And eventually they came to accept him, in spite of the fact that he sometimes might say things like, when he was trying to encourage people to move, he said, "Hasten forth rapidly there," which they must have convulsed them in laughter. These camps were pretty exciting, and all kinds of things happened there. There's his brands. That's how you knew. He had 3 brands. He had 2 pieces of property, 3 brands. He got into various contretemps with De Mores. That's De Mores again with his lovely mustache. Various confrontations, the 2 most powerful guys there, but they managed to survive. At one point, it looked like there was going to be a duel between the 2 of them, and the challenge was sort of delivered. TR stood up to it. De Mores said, no, it wasn't a challenge. It's interesting to think, because TR would not have survived a duel, or it would have been the future of America if they'd actually had that. TR had one confrontation with Indian Sioux. It was played up a bit, but really basically a misunderstanding. It's not clear whether Sioux had good or bad intentions. I don't know. Here's one of my favorite pictures of a Sioux. I think it really captures the majesty and pathos of a Indian warrior. I love it. TR's relationship with Indians at this stage, he was a kind of the only good Indian, is a dead Indian school, sort of. But later in life, he began much more understanding of it all. He went back east. Remember, he's a widower. Here's his childhood sweetheart, Edith. Remember I told you about her? He knew she was dangerous. He didn't want to get married again. He says, what do you do when you die and go to heaven if you have 2 wives? Seemed an interesting approach. But anyway, so he told his sister, who was a good friend of Edith's, that he didn't want to see Edith when he went back east. Well, sisters rarely do brothers suggest. So there she was. He was smitten. Within a month or 2, they were engaged and married pretty quickly. So his ideals went by the wayside. He went back and forth, and one of his most famous exploits was the boat thieves. A couple of three ruffians stole a boat from him. He and his two ranch hands here, they had to build another boat, chase them down. Oh, there's his guns. Somebody once asked what his guns are. There are a couple of his guns. Notice the handle here, that carved TR. Quite something, that gun. It's still around. So they go down the river. They built this boat. They eventually, after several days and very, very rough going, captured the thieves, take them further down, get to a place. TR wants to take them to Dickinson. So you have to go overland, I don't know, 60, 70 miles. There they are, the three bad guys. He found a farm that had this, and he trudged along behind for a day and a night and part of a day without sleeping, because he couldn't go to sleep when they were there. And when he got to Dickinson, he turned him over to the sheriff, and Dr. Stickney, who's here seen, TR walking down the street said, "Oh, hello," he stopped this guy. He said, "I'm looking for the local doctor." Well, the guy said, "I'm Dr. Stickney, come see me." He said he'd never seen a more bedraggled person. Later, he restaged it. Here's a photograph with using his ranch hands, slightly different version. He combined them together to make this, and that's what he did in his book. He took all these adventures and wrote them in books and published them. He published 3 of his trips there, extraordinary books, wrote them while he was there, and they were extremely successful. And that's how he made his living for most of his life. And then there was a famous hunt. He saw a head. There was a taxidermist in Medora, and he saw a head of, this is a mountain goat, white goats he called them. Very rare. People, almost nobody had seen them. They lived high, high in the mountains, way above the mountain. And very few people had seen them, even less had shot them. And many thought they were mythical. He wanted to shoot one. So he saw the one in this taxidermist shop, found out that a guy named Willis belonged to him. He lived in western Montana. So TR wrote Willis a letter saying, "Will you be my guide?" Willis writes back and says, "If your shooting is, what did he say? You're shooting any better than your writing, you needn't bother to come," because he had trouble to read his writing. TR persevered, went out, talked this guy into it after considerable difficulty. And here's the kind of place you got to hunt for these things. They are really tough. Look at that. I mean, they're just unbelievable what they do. So TR and the Hunter of Days, all the same old story over and over again. You can see the sheep up there, rather fanciful. Went hunting for these, and he succeeded. There he is, as he always did. He did a little Indian dance after he did it, and would offer, in this case, he offered Willis $1,000 as a bonus, and his rifle, which Willis claimed he refused to accept. Some years later, I and Jim Fugly, a good friend of mine from North Dakota, went out to see if we could find where this all happened. There it is up there, sort of retrace it. And one of the stories that was sort of fun is Willis said that TR, with his camera, wanted to take, you can see me down there, wanted to take a picture in this gorge of a waterfall, which you can sort of see somewhere in there, I think. But he couldn't get a shot of it, so TR said, "Tie me to a lariat and lower me down to a good spot." So they did that, but they couldn't bring him up. So eventually they had to cut him loose and drop him some 40 feet. Lucky he wasn't killed. There were several experiences on this trip where he might easily be killed. I don't know if that story ever happened. Tales grew. They embellished. This story was written in a book 40 years later, but something like it probably did. And then the winter came, the bad, bad winter, the winter of 85, 86, when all the weaknesses of ranching there were exposed. The worst winter we'd seen in a generation, maybe several generations. It killed something like 70% of the stock, and everybody went bust. So that was kind of the end of it. TR lost pretty much all of his investment, which was well over $1 million. De Mores was out of it, but TR came out of this ahead of the game. He had his writings, he made his money, and he went on to be president. De Mores had less of a successful rest of life and went back to Europe, didn't really get anywhere. Some 10 or 14 years later, was trying to mount a campaign to throw the British out of Egypt, goes into the Sahara and is murdered by the Tuaregs. So the whole thing came to an end. Now, and there you can just see some of the cattle. Today, the town of Medora, which was the town where TR was, has survived. Of all the little tens of thousands of little cowboy towns, this one has survived, not because of De Mores, but because of TR. The Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the only national park named after a person, is there. And very imaginative North Dakotans have built the whole thing. This is an amphitheater in that little county, which still only has 1,000 people in it. The town itself, Medora, only has 100 or so, and yet they have this amphitheater with seats 2,200 people, and they bring people in the summer, and it's really quite a roaring town. It's a terrific place. You've got to go there. This is called the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation operation. You've got to go to North Dakota and the Badlands. It's really worth the trip. And now there's an effort being mounted to build a Theodore Roosevelt Museum and presidential library. Ed O'Keefe, friend of mine, is running it, as is Randy Hatzenblumer out there. And I think they'll be successful, and they will have a presidential library in a few years. So, as I say, you definitely should go. Well, there we are. I'm ready for Q&A. You can write your questions in the little question box up top here, and maybe on a different part of your screen. And Rita will relay them to me.
I actually have quite a few here for you, Professor Roosevelt.
Thank you.
Okay, but I do encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A format in the icon that Professor Roosevelt mentioned. The first question is, did Theodore keep a journal of his Badland experience?
TR kept a journal throughout his life. As a young kid, there are now published sort of the boyhood journals of TR. They were perfunctory. They were meant to be mind, reminders of him. He was very careful about every shot he took and every kill he made. And he would kind of talk in bullet points to remind him, to help him write the books. But he did that pretty much all his life. And they're all now at Harvard in the Houghton Library.
What books do you recommend that folks can read regarding the Badlands experience?
TR in the Badlands. I don't have it right next to me here. There are 3 or 4. Hagedorn, who was a historian, interviewed people at the time and wrote a book called TR in the Badlands. And that's interesting because he spoke to people who remembered it. And then when you ask me the next question, I'll see if I can get the name of the other book. So ask me another question.
Okay. When did Teddy Roosevelt first learn to ride?
Teddy, can you hear me here?
Well, you're a little far away, but...
I'll be right back. The book, by the way, is called Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands by Silverstro. S-I-D-D-I and then S-I-L-V-E-S-T-R-O. Great book. He had ridden all his life, basically. Not as a little kid, but certainly as a young man. I don't remember whether he rode at Harvard. I don't think so, because his experience had been in the East. He'd been up to places like Maine, where you were in boats, or the Adirondacks. So I don't think it was until he was an adult. But when he got his house, Sagamore Hill. Sagamore Hill, by the way, is where he spent most of his life. It's on the North Shore of Long Island, run by the Park Service. Do a terrific job. You got to go visit it. It's in Oyster Bay. And he started learning to ride there.
Okay. And how would you describe Roosevelt's style of leadership during these adventures?
Well, I mean, that's a big story. Read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, uh, among others. I think Doris, you're actually on this. If you are, the books are great. Any case, uh, he, the quick answer to that, and this, you remember, he was San Juan Hill. He was a colonel in the infantry. I mean, in the cavalry. His view was, don't ask anybody to do what you wouldn't do. Do more than anybody else, and if you do, they will follow you, and they did. So very much take care of your men. I'm going to do a talk on TR and the Navy next, and one of the subjects will be this current contretemps that's going on with the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt. I'll address this issue some more then.
Okay. And then I have, did TR ever visit the South Dakota Badlands?
That's a good question. I'm sure he did. You know, he did many trips through the West when he was running for offices, you know, and such, like political trips. I guess he must have, but I don't know for sure. I don't, of course, you know, the Badlands, the Mount Rushmore was just, I don't even know, I don't know when Mount Rushmore started, when the sculptor started on it, but certainly wasn't finished by any means, was done till after his death. So don't know he must have been to South Dakota, but I don't remember when or where.
Okay. And then I have another final two questions before we end today. Do you know Alice Roosevelt Longworth's views on this period of her father's life?
Well, she was a baby, so she didn't have any views. In retrospect, gosh, I don't know. I don't, I'll have to ask my cousin Joanna, her granddaughter, who I bet is on this call. I don't know what she thought about him then. She admired her father, but they had an interesting relationship because she was the first child. That's another whole long story. I'm going to do a session on the Roosevelt family life at some point, and I'll go into more and I'll find out about that.
Okay. And then the one final question, someone is asking about how you had mentioned that Teddy was writing and shooting to outrun his grief. And then
Yes?
what did he do with the animals that
That he shot?
had
Okay,
shot?
that's another whole subject. Sometimes historians, for example, Edmund Morris, take him to task for the amount of animals he killed, but they are people who have no experience of having to live in the outdoors for weeks at a time, and how much you have to shoot just to eat. You can't take food with you. You have to shoot along the way, and it can't preserve it. So a lot of that was for food, but he preserved the heads of the trophies, if you will. He was a trophy hunter. In older life, he got to be much less so, but he was never what he called a game butcher. He wouldn't just shoot and shoot. For example, when he was after the white goats, he shot, I think, 2, and he was urged by his guide to shoot more, and he said, no, he has no interest in shooting more. He'd done what he needed. So he brought them back. Many of them are at Sagamore Hill and various other places as heads. I notice around, if you go to Harvard, there are a bunch of heads they claim are his. Here you go, they're heads. Supposedly, if he'd shot all the heads he was supposed to, he would have done nothing else in the rest of his life but shoot heads. Well, excuse me. I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. The next one will be TR in the Navy a month from now on Tuesday, June 16th at noon. If you go to roosevelt.liu for Long Island University, roosevelt.liu.edu, you can get more information and you can sign up there so that you'll be part of our group and get more information and learn more about the Theodore Roosevelt Institute activities. Soon, probably in a couple of days, we will be posting this video as well, and you can all watch it on YouTube. So again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you next month. Stay safe, wash your hands.